Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Brendan Teeling. I work in Dublin City Council. It's a great pleasure to see so many of you here on this Friday evening for what is the big start of our annual Dublin Festival of History, which is put together by, funded by Dublin City Council, put together by Dublin City Libraries and the Dublin City Council Culture Company. This is the start of a fantastic two and a half weeks or so of history of all kinds, about all sorts of people in various places around the city, but starting off in the historical heart of the city of medieval Dublin here in Dublin Castle. And before I go any further, and before I forget, I just want to give a thanks to various people. You'll see people going around in the t-shirts, and they're here to help the weekend go smoothly and your time here at the festival to go as pleasantly as possible. But I do want in particular to thank some people who, without whom, etc., the festival couldn't have been put together. Cormac Kinsella, Donal Fallon, and two special people who are here, Sri and Heather. They're here around, but give them a round of applause because they've worked so hard, so thank you very much. Just to say, we will have some photographs taken, so if you don't want to be featured in a photograph, you might let one of the people in the t-shirts know, please. There will be signing afterwards from the authors outside, and signing of a different kind in Irish Sign Language here from Cormac Leonard and Sarah, who will be here taking over from him as well. And just to say that we did have a last-minute addition to the programme, which is The Last Disco, which is the book that was written about the Stardust, an event that we all know came to some sort of a closure with the inquests, and the book with Christine Bone, Sean Murray and Nicky Ryan. That's on here at 8 o'clock, and I'd encourage you, if you haven't booked for it, to hang around, go along to it. It promises to be a fascinating and indeed, I think, a somber look as well at one of the dark days, dark periods in our history. And it's a personal connection. I could well have been there. My next door neighbour was there, and thankfully survived, but of course, as we know, very many didn't. So that's The Last Disco, and that's at 8 o'clock here this evening. So our first session, we go back to a key period in Irish history and the foundation of the state. That is the Civil War. And we're delighted to have a session on the newly published Atlas of the Irish Civil War. The Atlas of the Irish Revolution was a huge hit, and indeed was a great hit as a book, but a great hit here at the festival some years ago. And we're delighted to have a panel of four people to talk about the Atlas. I'm not going to introduce them. I'm just going to introduce the person who's going to keep them in order and keep the conversation going, and that's Donal Fallon. So if you welcome Donal and our panellists, and he's going to introduce them. Thank you.
Hello friends, you're all so welcome along to this year's festival. We're doing things a little differently, beginning with the big weekend, and what a great response. I think only Oasis could move tickets quicker in this town than the Atlas of the Irish Civil War, and just like Oasis, you crashed the website. But we got there in the end, and we don't believe in dynamic pricing. Everything is free. When the Bureau of Military History was established, its official brief was, and I quote, "to assemble and coordinate material to form the basis for the compilation of the history of the movement for independence from the formation of the Irish Volunteers on the 25th of November 1913 to the 11th of July 1921. And of course, a lot happened before the formation of the Irish Volunteers, not least of all here in Dublin, but plenty happened after the truce of July 1921 as well. And this new study from Cork University Press, the Atlas of the Irish Civil War, New Perspectives, I think that this atlas, like the one on the revolution before it, this is a moment in Irish history. This is a landmark moment in Irish historiography and what we know about the period. The diversity of case studies in this book is extraordinary. Everything from how Protestants experienced the conflict to the importance of the labour movement, from commemoration of the conflict to artistic engagement with it. And the format of the event today, we've designed this in such a way that you'll get a sense of the scope of the atlas, gathered here, with the honourable exception of John Crowley and Mike Murphy. We have the editorial team, John Borgonovo, Donal O'Driscoll and Elaine O'Keefe, and they're going to talk for about 5 minutes each on aspects of the Atlas. Then we're going to have a chat as a panel, and then, always a dangerous thing to do with the Irish Civil War, we're going to open it up to the floor. And I'm sure there's plenty of opinions on the floor. And it would be great to start, as we mean to go on with this festival, to hear from you in the audience. So you will get your chance to speak, but first of all, we're going to invite 3 of the editors to speak on aspects of the Atlas. I think beginning with you, Hélène.
Thank you so much, Donal, for that lovely introduction and description of the Atlas. We're really delighted to be here this evening to open the Dublin Festival of History here in the Printworks. And thank you to Donal, to Cormac, to Brian, and to all the organisers for the invitation. So my colleagues are going to speak in a moment, but I'm just going to begin I think with an exploration of one of the images, the key images in the Atlas of the Irish Civil War. We thought it was appropriate to begin this evening's talk about a new atlas produced in partnership with the National Library of Ireland and the latest in that highly visual Cork University Press Atlas series with a single eloquent image. A search for traces of the Irish Civil War in the National Library's vast collection leads inevitably to the catalogue of sepia images captured by Cork-born photographer and British Army veteran W.D. Hogan. Sanctioned by the National Army in a climate of strict military censorship, Hogan's gelatin silver prints of uniformed soldiers, political rallies and state funerals have become a defining visual reference point for that troubled period in Irish history. Unusual in his collection that focuses primarily on the progress of the Civil War from the Free State perspective is this photograph of a solitary, barefoot child. He holds aloft a sword salvaged from the ruins of Victoria, now Collins Barracks in Cork City, after it was burned by the retreating IRA garrison in August 1922. The composition is simple, the subject modest, but the image is powerfully evocative of the social, political, and indeed cultural context of Ireland in the midst of civil war. The ceremonial sabre, abandoned by an officer of the evacuating British Army, speaks to the surprising speed in the end of the regime change that followed the ratification of the Anglo-Irish Treaty in January 1922. The weapon shouldered by a child is a potent metaphor for the steady militarisation of Irish society after 1913 and the normalisation of political violence for a generation born into war. The sabre is also suggestive of the continued British influence on Irish events during and long after 1922, and the ruined backdrop is a reminder of the wide-scale physical damage wrought by that civil war. The boy's frayed cap and bare feet testify to the extreme poverty of Ireland's working class in the face of economic depression and high unemployment, which forced families to hunt for salvage in the wreckage and for many of their sons to don the serge green uniform of the new National Army. Shawled and indistinct at the edge of the frame, the woman and girl are representative of the many still untold stories of female experience during the Irish Revolution and the underexplored intergenerational aspects or impact of those formative years. These themes, implicit and explicit in this image, stamped, if you look closely, with a 100-year-old fingerprint, are among those we sought to explore in this new Atlas of the Irish Civil War. Organised into 10 thematic sections and building on the 2017 Atlas of the Irish Revolution, it showcases the fruits of new research by almost 90 scholars from a range of disciplines. Working with new or neglected sources, or revisiting more traditional sources through new analytical frameworks, their work has pushed Civil War historiography beyond those familiar simplistic dichotomies, beyond the study of key protagonists or the chronologies of armed conflict, and arrived at more nuanced, inclusive treatments of that complex period. As promised in its subtitle, the Atlas introduces fresh perspectives on how the Civil War battle lines were drawn and crossed, how lives were lost or transformed, and how the conflict was experienced, perceived, and remembered. The photograph, not to squeeze the traditional 1,000 words out of a particular image, but this photograph is also representative of how we sought to engage with what President Michael D. Higgins called the view from below, the people's history of the time in question. We wanted to explore the significance of the everyday, the lived experience of the Irish Civil War, what life was like for those bystanders swept up in the struggle, for those whose property was confiscated or destroyed, whose livelihoods were threatened by downed communications or torn up roads, or those who simply tried to get on with life against the backdrop of political violence. The visualization of the Irish Civil War in this book sets out to capture that human dimension partly through letters, autograph books and diary entries, like this one by the pro-treaty TD from Cork, Liam de Rochta. I'm suddenly very aware of the purely coincidental, very Cork bias in my first two slides. I must apologise for that. Handwritten or illustrated documents like these are often poignant in their intimacy and revelatory of the writer's preoccupations with everything from politics and ideology to the bread and butter issues facing so many Irish families in 1922 and 1923. With such privileged access to the National Library's collection and donations from other archives, libraries across the country and private collections, we're also able to include a selection of government and military reports and memoranda. These provide insights into the deeply held convictions that sparked and perpetuated the 10-month Civil War, and indeed the often neglected efforts before and during the conflict to reconcile the two sides. Material culture, graffiti, portraiture, ballads, photographs and cartoons all have their own stories to tell about how the conflict was perceived and interpreted. Such rare and in many cases previously unpublished images and documents open a window onto the past, capturing moments as they happened and phenomena that do not necessarily lend themselves easily to mapping. De Rochta, for example, wrote of the calmness of the people in Cork City on the day after the Four Courts was bombarded in Dublin. Not only because of the assumption that the business, as he called it, would soon be over, but also because of the, quote, many episodes we have lived through during the past 6 or 7 years. Our senses of wonder and surprise are dulled or deadened. To exist for the day and not to worry about the future has become the habit. Some of the most powerful visuals, and there are 400 in this book, some of the most powerful of those visuals relate to the propaganda war, which my co-author, or co-editor rather, and author of a chapter on the subject, Donal Drisceoil, will now speak to you a little bit about. Thank you very much.
Very good. Thanks a million, Hélène. Yeah, propaganda, which, as you know, is I suppose, a method or a form or a technique of persuasion, as are advertising and public relations. And it's no accident, indeed, that the head of the British propaganda operation in Ireland, 1920-21, or Publicity as it was called, was a chap called Basil Clarke, who went on to become one of the founders of one of the very first PR companies in the world in 1924. And Clarke's favourite trick was what he called propaganda by news, basically lies and half-truths presented with an air of verisimilitude or believability or an air of truthfulness. And he had limited success, as we know, due to the resistance of most of the Irish press and scepticism on the part of most Irish readers. And the Irish independence movement basically won the propaganda war hands down. And one of those who masterminded that campaign was one Desmond Fitzgerald. He was Minister then for Publicity or Propaganda for the Free State side after the treaty split, and he had a lot more success than Clarke, or than the British had in the Clarke period, basically because the vast majority, 99.9% of newspapers supported the treaty, the provisional government, the National Army, the Free State, whatever you want to call it, as did a majority of the population. So he was also helped by the effective censorship operation operated by Piers Beasley, which we'll talk about later. And cartoons, as you see here, were a key dimension of the propaganda war, a very simple and effective way of essentialising the core message. And we present many of these cartoons in the atlas among the 400 illustrations that Hélène talked about. And And along with other contemporaneous documents, they're a key aspect of what we're trying to do to kind of complement and amplify the text, to connect and engage readers in a different way, and really give a window into the time, how it felt at the time, how the conflict was presented to people at the time. And on the left there you see Arthur Griffith, of course, who declared in the Dáil in December 1921 that the treaty negotiators had, quote, brought back the flag. We have brought back the evacuation of Ireland after 700 years by British troops and the formation of an Irish army. And it was a perfect opportunity for anti-treaty cartoonists called to subvert the message and show what flag he really brought back, according to the anti-treatyites, right? The central plank of anti-treaty propaganda was that the treaty was a British solution to a British problem, an imperial solution to an imperial problem. And those who supported it and those who signed the treaty, like Griffith and Collins, were British dupes. And that British dimension is often elided in the historiography, actually, and the Civil War is frequently presented in purely internal Irish terms. So we've broadened it out from that. The first chapter is by Heather Jones on the British perspectives, and what she shows are some very interesting things in terms of the validity of a lot of the claims that were made by Republicans at the time. The destructive dimensions of the anti-treaty response were an obvious target for pro-treaty propaganda. As we see there on the right, anti-treaty arguments were consistently dismissed as irrational, emotional, violent. The only real argument they could deliver against the treaty was violence and destruction. And basically the motley crew of outsiders and hooligans who made up the anti-treaty side were given a veneer of respectability or even legitimacy by De Valera, who was the real reason for the Civil War, according to Free State propaganda. So the sober and detailed anti-treaty paper Public na hÉireann, which was a weekly refutation in print of these accusations, but that mattered little in the propaganda war. So the benefits of having a tangible achievement, however limited, was central to the pro-treaty presentation of itself and its Free State, which made it possible all these goodies that you can see Santi there presenting in December 1922, and indeed a very similar looking St. Patrick down there at the bottom. The Free State made possible all of this and was also a bridge or a stepping stone to freedom. The alternative was not a republic. De Valera's document number 2, even in the unlikely event that the British accepted it, did not deliver a republic, as the Free State side kept emphasising. The alternative instead, as you see there, was chaos, destruction and more war. For anti-treatyites, the alternative was the continuation of the good fight. Easter week repeats itself. The defence of the Republic sold out by the venal and traitorous Carey Collins, as he is here in Constance Markovitch's cartoon, after the notorious Fenian traitor, of course, James Carey, and comic Cosgrave there in the background, misled by the faker Fitzgerald with his Union Jack waistcoat, and blessed by the bishop who tells Hibernia, who's in chains there, "Take any oath, my child, that will get you out of your difficulties." More comparative research is needed, I think, to back up Gavin Foster's contention that the Irish Civil War, quote, stands out for the ferocity of the invective and partisan rhetoric that accompanied it. But there's little doubt that the crude binaries and the bitter animosities produced by the propaganda war continue to exert an influence on Irish politics, on Irish media discourse, and arguably the historiography of the Civil War for many decades afterwards. So you see here election posters that continue the blame game in Free State politics. The Common na Gael poster was part of a very sophisticated campaign by McConnell's advertising agency here in Dublin, first modern ad agency really in Ireland, founded in 1916. And it emphasises again the close relationship between advertising and propaganda. The IRA no longer needed demonisation. They could be dealt with by emergency powers and censorship. The democratic political challenge posed by Fianna Fáil, however, meant that the blaming of De Valera for the Civil War became centre stage. And you see the Republican poster there emphasising the brutality of Cosgrave's murder gang. And this, rather than the Britishness of the Free State regime, became the central trope of anti-treaty propaganda in the later phase of the Civil War and afterwards. And you see poor old Dev there being shown all the dead on both sides and being asked, they died for an empty formula, really, was it worth it? You know, the oath which Fianna Fáil recast as an empty formula to enter the Dáil. This Civil War-related tit-for-tat continued in a sustained way up until at least the Second World War. But I argue in my chapter that it was the other dimension of the war of words that had an even more enduring and damaging legacy. At a formative historical juncture, both sides embraced censorship with gusto to silence and or delegitimize their opponents. And this illiberal authoritarian reflex became embedded in the political culture of independent Ireland, allied to the deference of both sides to the Catholic moral agenda. This saw censorship emerge as a defining feature of the new state, much to the detriment of Irish culture and Irish democracy. So I've made my pitch. That all of this and more is in the chapter in the book, but just to give you a flavour of where I'm coming from and some of the images that we're using. So I'll hand you over to John now, who's going to conclude this short presentation. Thank you, John.
Yeah, so we have, so Donal has a big chapter and a section on propaganda, but that's just one of many sections in the book where you look at different aspects, political, social, economic, cultural, around the Civil War. And at the base of that, and the foundation of the whole project is kind of drawing together a community of scholars working in multiple disciplines, both inside and beyond academia. And what we wanted to do was we wanted to draw in anybody who's producing kind of new research that is really, we think will draw attention and draw interest from the wider public. And that kind of research is difficult. It's often archival based. And what we also found with this project was a lot of this research wasn't done when we were producing the Atlas of the Irish Revolution in from 2015 to 2017. A lot of this research is quite recent. And it's still ongoing. So it's just kind of a snapshot of the state of the field as it is. So I just wanted to give you two maps, 2 of 50 that we have in the Atlas. And this is from a scholar called Juster Stover Dolan, who teaches at Idaho State University in Pocatello, Idaho, and he looked at compensation claims from the Civil War period relating to property damage. And this map, he looked at, kind of mapped a bunch of different counties, but I wanted to just zero in on County Clare. And I don't know who said it first, but one of the things that's fascinating about the Civil War is, we know about Dublin, we know about the forecourts, we know about Kerry, we know about kind of hot activity up in Mayo and Sligo, but there are a whole lot of parts of the country where not that many people got killed. And County Clare, which had been quite active in the War of Independence, was relatively quiet, particularly compared to the previous conflict. But when you look close, and that's partially because the big powerful IRA unit, the East Clare Brigade, went pro-treaty, and they provided a big kind of a bulk of the National Army strength, at least at the outset of hostilities. But when you look more closely at what goes on in County Clare, there's all kinds of agrarian activity. People knocking down fences, people knocking down, and there's kind of low-level sabotage, but a lot of it's agrarian tension that's erupting. And Clare had seen a couple of different outbreaks of this, even going back before the war in 1913, but then again in 1917, 1918, 1920, there was land hunger in the county, and every time that there was basically a policing vacuum, that land hunger would break forward. And so you see a really good example of it, particularly in West Clare, where they're just knocking the hell out of each other. And the black stars there are cattle drives. Which, as a Western American, I love a good cattle drive. And again, a traditional form of agrarian hassle between people who are tillage farmers who seek land from pasture from cattle ranchers who are taking up and raising livestock and driving up the price of property. And so this is targeting that kind of old cow versus plow tension is reemerging in 1922 and 1923. So that's the kind of leveled research that generates some really fascinating insights. And what we always like about what we say about a map is a good map tells a story. And so here's good archival research that's telling an interesting story. Now, probably I don't know if it's the outstanding map, could be, but it's definitely the most intensely researched, and that would be Andy Bielenberg and John Dorney's fatality map. And this is a connected project with this book, but Andy and John have a chapter, and then also, as I'll explain, they also list all the fatalities of the Civil War. So they basically undertook like a 2-year research project where they went around and they quantified, counted, identified everybody known to have been killed in the Civil War for the first time ever, giving us a firm figure. And we were able to map their data, and this is also part of a website, a digital project that Hélène can speak to as well. But the map is really striking, I think. And what you're seeing is fatalities. You can't quite make out the different identities, IRA, Free State, civilian, but it doesn't really matter. It shows you just the clusters of violence, of intense violence and fighting. From Dublin, which sees this ongoing bloodshed, down to Kerry, Cork, Tipperary, flashes up in Connacht, and then down in Wexford as well. And so it's this is kind of what best case scenario for us. Really intensive archival research, bringing out original and important scholarship, and then we make it accessible and so that you can visualize it and you can experience it in a different way. And then finally, Andy Bielenberg and John Dorney also allowed us to print out their death list for the first time ever, where we have names of everybody killed in the Civil War, where it happened, what county, the date, and any affiliation, whether they're a member of the IRA, the National Army, civilian, what have you, and the age of the person. And this is pretty extraordinary. It's basically like it's a memorial, essentially, to everybody who died. It's a way of capturing that. And again, this is kind of the essence of what we're trying to accomplish, which is encourage original, archival, important scholarship, present it to a broader audience in a way that they can understand, and doing so in a way that improves our concept of a very complex and complicated conflict. On that note, I'll hand back over to Donal, and we'll have a bit of a chat. So thank you very much.
So by total chance this week, I was rereading Noel Brown's memoir, Against the Tide, great book. And Noel remembered going into the Dáil in the 1940s as a young man. And he said, as a young politician in Leinster House, I recall my shock at the white-hot hate with which that terrible episode had marked their lives. The trigger words were 77, Ballyseedy, Dick and Joe, and above all else, the treaty. We still have a Dáil with many people in it whose relations played a role in the Civil War. Micheál Martin, Mary Lou MacDonald, even the President, Michael D. Higgins in the Orris. I think it's great that the President wrote the introduction to this book, and it was Michael D. Higgins, of course, who stirred us through the decade of centenaries. How do you all feel on how that went? Because the Atlas of the Irish Revolution was a big part of the decade of centenaries. It was the great intellectual output of it in some ways.
In terms of the decade itself.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that people who worked in the field always knew that there was intense public interest. And I think the decade basically allowed folks to engage with it. And there's a deep root. I mean, look at the crowd here tonight. I've done a couple decade events at this festival before, and also gotten just insane crowds. And so if you work in the field, you know that people connect with it in a way that they don't connect with a lot of other topics in Irish history. And I think the decade allowed folks to platform their scholarship and then open it up for wider engagement. And the success of the Atlas and our various projects, our TV series, again shows that if you make this scholarship available, people will absolutely flock to it. School kids love it, and it's this mixture of local identity, and then it's connecting out to broader issues. And I think in that way it was greatly successful.
And just more broadly, I'd like to hear people's views on that decade of centenaries, and particularly the role of Michael D. Higgins in it, because I think with the involvement of his father and the impact that the revolution had on his father, I couldn't think of anyone better to lead us through that period.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the phrase we associate with President Michael D. Higgins' sort of, I suppose, stewardship in lots of ways of this period is ethical remembrance. This sort of, I suppose, encouragement to learn as much as possible about the different perspectives, the different experiences, and to sort of re-look at this period again with that more informed perspective. I think that's been a really important guide, if you like. I also think that with the decade of centenaries, the ownership that communities at a local level have taken of their own history has been really, really important. And the availability, I suppose, of new archives, new sources that people could, as Maurice Manning said, trace their own commemorative paths through, learn more about what happened in their own locality, and then commemorate that as a community. That's been really, really special, I think, to the decade of centenaries. For us, obviously, our contribution has been, from UCC, has been that addition to the conversation around the decade of centenaries, built upon the Atlas of the Irish Revolution, that enormous volume known as much for its physical weight as the weightiness of its contents. But that has allowed us, as John alluded to collaborate with national institutions like the National Library, with the national broadcaster for online digital projects and in-person events. And I suppose to contribute to and lead and in some ways add to the conversations around what happened 100 years ago. So we've been really, really lucky to be kind of at that centre of that conversation over the last couple of years. So that's a long answer to your short question.
A staff member in Hodges Figgis told me they had to double bag the Atlas of the Irish Revolution. Kept falling through the bag before people even left the shop. But the great success of it led to a television series, and what was very unusual in that television series, and what's almost unheard of, is that you had co-producer status on it, and you were kind of able to shape what that programme looked like. I mean, that generally doesn't happen for historians in that field. Could you talk a little bit about that series, because it was a real landmark moment in Irish television.
Yeah, so the Irish Revolution was the first one. Is this working?
Yep.
Which was 3-part with Tyrone Productions, Ruan McGann, and then we followed that up with the Irish Civil War subsequently. I think, was that last year? The year before?
Year before, yeah.
So it's fantastic, and we had 2 film stars narrating it, which is always nice. Cillian Murphy first time and Brendan Gleeson second time, so that was sweet as well, It just sort of adds something to it, I think, no matter what, I mean, my natural cynicism has had to be overcome, but it really worked. And I mean, the point is that most of the people who contributed to those documentaries were people who were in the Atlas or in both Atlases. But yeah, I mean, Ruan mightn't have always appreciated our editorial help, right? In that we had to kind of pin him down and force him to do certain things. But I think in the end it actually worked out. It was a really good collaboration, and I mean, he's a great guy, and it's a very difficult thing to do to kind of encapsulate this complex story in that way. You have to be in awe of that ability. As regards the decade in general, though, I mean, we kind of had a wake in 2023 thinking it was all over, and here we are in 2024, which is fantastic, but it's been beautiful. It's been beautiful, and I didn't think it would be. I really thought everyone would be sick and tired of it by the time we got to the end of it, but actually the length sort of lent itself to it, and as you say, Michael D's sort of, intelligent engagement as well, I think was a great help.
Yeah, and there was a lot of thinking on our feet during it, like in Dublin, a lot of the key anniversaries, for example, Bloody Sunday or the hanging of Kevin Barry were obviously impacted by the pandemic, but the GAA still pulled off a very beautiful, very moving commemoration. But when it came around to the Civil War, there was so much worry around things like Ballyseedy, but it actually turned out to be quite a unifying event in that community, didn't it, in a lot of ways. The maps, when I opened the book, I went straight to some of the maps. Pádraig Yates has a great map accompanying his piece of post office raids across the island of Ireland, shows the lawlessness that was going on during the Civil War. But Donal, there's a great map in one of your entries as well. You're back to a familiar subject. I loved your book on censorship in Ireland during the Second World War. And in this book, you write about censorship in the Civil War. When we think about censorship, we often think about the state. The state is banning books, the state is banning newspapers. But actually what the map shows is that Republican repression of the printing press was very real as well. And it's a very intriguing map, the Kerry people, the Sligo Champion, for example, shut down by the IRA. Can you talk a little bit about that censorship during the war?
Sure, censorships, I think, probably, Donal, and thanks for your kind comments. I suppose it was 4 censorships, really, if you think about it, right? So, because this book covers the pre-Civil War period as well, we should emphasize, really from the treaty being signed, in December 1921. So you have that sort of 6-month period before the Civil War starts, where you had kind of a mini pre-Civil War, where you had lots of stuff happening and lots of conflict happening, and that's when a lot of the newspapers are targeted. So in terms of 4 censorships that I describe, the first one is the structural censorship, as Pierre Bourdieu might put it, of the absolute media consensus in favor of the treaty. 99.9%, as I said in my presentation, 3 regional newspapers, none of the national newspapers oppose the treaty. Right. So that's a huge, that's essentially structural censorship. So that leads then frustrated anti-treatyites to take out the sledgehammer, really, smash up the Freeman's Journal, seize copies of papers, intimidate journalists, quite nasty stuff. That, of course, was a PR own goal in terms of international media. It's like, look at them, they're thugs, they're dictators and all of that. They're terrorists, they're anarchists. So that was another form, sledgehammer censorship, as it was called, right? So you have structural censorship, sledgehammer censorship, then the war breaks out, and there's 2 censorships now. There's the state censorship, provisional government, based in Dublin, Pierce Beasley's censorship, which is basically controls what leaves the country, controls what all the newspapers can say. This is where the term irregulars famously comes from. The newspapers couldn't describe Republicans in sort of military terms or in any way other than in derogatory terms, and you had to describe the Free State side as the government, the legitimate government. So this is about a battle for legitimisation, really. And then on the other side, in Cork, and in Munster, where Republicans were in charge for the first sort of 7 weeks, they had their own censorship operation there. They controlled the Cork newspapers, the Cork Examiner, the Cork Constitution. Famous names like Sean O'Phelan and Frank O'Connor were actually young censors in those papers at the time. So there was this constant battle. And there really was, as I said in my presentation there, that the censorship reflex was sort of automatic for both sides, and I think that really had a detrimental effect in the longer term,
One should never judge a book by its cover, but we all do, whether we want to admit it or not. Both of these books so far are just beautiful covers, and the book is a visual feast. We have work in it by artists who are active participants in the revolution. Estella Solomons is there. We have people who created the kind of definitive artwork of the national story, like Sean Keating. And then we've got contemporary leading artists. There's a great depiction of Erskine Childers by Mick O'Dea that appeared in a stamp last year. It'd be great to hear about the process of illustrating a work like this. Not only are the artworks marvellous, but many of the pictures, for example, the smashed up Freeman's Journal office, I'd never seen before. So I'm presuming the Irish Examiner archive played a big role here, but where did images come from more broadly?
Can I answer that? Yeah. Okay, I think first of all I need to say that when it comes to the sort of the visualization of the book, enormous credit should go to our co-editor John Crowley. He's really, really passionate about the visuals, and it was him, I think, more than any of us, and when he said it, it made complete sense to us that the cover of this book really should be a Sean Keating, because this book, builds upon and is intended to be complementary to and, read alongside in some ways the Atlas of the Irish Revolution. And that was so iconically, covered with the Men of the South by Sean Keating. So it made sense that an allegory, which again, another incredibly powerful image, should be the cover of this one. And Emer O'Connor, the art historian, writes a beautiful analytical piece explaining the allegory, I suppose, that Keating intended inside the Atlas. With regard to the other images, we were incredibly lucky, I think, with this volume, having established relationships with, archival institutions, with the National Gallery, with people who not only curate but also create these incredible works of art with the Atlas of the Irish Revolution. So in many cases, it was returning to old friends and asking again if we could reproduce some images. With the newer pieces, we have an incredible piece of work by a very young student, Joshua Griffiths, who is a student in MTU in Tralee. And their assignment for university work was to respond visually to the archival documents relating to the Civil War in County Kerry. And he created this incredible 2-piece digital art design of, I think it's titled Elizabeth Dunn. And it's intended to visually represent the way in which women, and in Elizabeth's case, she was a member of Cumann na mBan in County Kerry, who was identified in September 1922 as one of the women who were sympathetic to the irregulars, as the Irish Independent put it, and was humiliated and painted green in an appalling example of violence against her, or gender-based violence. So the picture is meant to depict the way in which experiences like that, humiliations like that, trauma like that, impacted women. And I mean, obviously, everybody but women in this case. And it depicts just the top of her head as far as her nose on the first panel, and the bottom panel is the rest of her body submerged beneath the water, suggesting a sort of a muteness, a mutism, as a suppression of her ability to speak as a result of that trauma. It's incredibly powerful. It's one of some of the more contemporary pieces. We also have pieces by Hughie O'Donoghue in the latter part of the atlas, dealing with the legacies of the Irish Civil War, and as you mentioned, Mick O'Dea as well, two of his pieces that were actually commissioned by An Post as commemorative stamps to mark the centenary. So with those, we were very lucky. We approached the artists in question, I suppose, and because of maybe familiarity with the Atlas of the Irish Revolution, they were willing to contribute to this. So we were very, very lucky with that. And it's lovely to have that mixture of the contemporary artwork, as you said, created by actual participants in the events themselves, and then obviously artwork by artists living today who are giving their perspective on the time. So that mix is really, really important. So, like the other atlas, I suppose it's incredibly visual, and there's a nice mixture between artwork and photography. And I've been talking for too long about the visuals.
I think Mick O'Dea's work during the decade of centenaries has been really incredible.
Well, and he was absolutely open to. He made his stuff available to us, engaged with us, and so it's a kind of generosity. Another, we have some photographs and some really rare ones that I don't think have really been seen before from a historian up in Mayo and Sligo called Frank Fagan, that he got from families, stuff that's never been seen. And so we had a number of people who were just quite willing to share either their artwork or these photographs. And when you have that kind of cooperation, it makes this stuff relatively easy to pull off. Not that easy, but easier than it could be.
There's a couple of things that I'd always believed that are kind of shattered by the book, and one of them, John, is around one of your entries on Cumann na Saoirse, which for anyone who's ever heard of them, Cumann na Saoirse was the pro-treaty Cumann na mBan. Next time you're walking down Henry Street, there's a plaque at the site of what was Jenny Wise Power's shop and home. She was the central figure behind the pro-treaty women's group. And what I didn't know before reading the atlas was that in Cork, the picture wasn't as clear-cut as in most of the country. You're right that roughly half of the city members of Cumann na mBan joined this pro-treaty group in Cork. So there's little things like that we learn from the atlas on a very localized level.
Yeah, and again, Cumann na Saoirse, the only kind of organization that's not recognized in the military service pensions collections, which is kind of military. And I haven't done, there are other historians who've done work on Cumann na Saoirse as well, so I'm not going to hoover up all the accolades. But in Cork, yeah, there was a split between two rival factions that goes back to holding a dance on Palm Sunday Eve in 1917, and it split the movement in Cork for like 5 years. And a lot of, so that kind of, and it's really easy to exaggerate personal dynamics and that kind of stuff, but there are some of those relationships kind of come out in the political split as well. So yeah, you see that Cumann na Saoirse, and we have a good picture of the vivant tableau, like the which is where people, which was a common with Cumann na mBan fundraising things, where you do these kind of visual shows where you'd recreate images from history or great paintings. And so we got a great picture of these, a visit from Michael Collins to Cork, and there's a vivant tableau going on. And then IRA guys broke in and they threw red pepper over the whole audience in the Cork Opera House and fired revolver shots. And, so that kind of, and Hélène talked about the lived experience. There's the part of when you look at Cumann na Saoirse and Cumann na mBan in this period is, they were quite at the front face of the, they were fronting their respective sides to a certain extent. Public meetings, campaigning during elections, things like funerals.
One of the reasons we know about coming to censorship nationally is because something like 60 branches nationally marched to Michael Collins's funeral procession from across the country. So that kind of the idea of that kind of participation is, and again, that's just part of the zeitgeist of the moment, really.
Talk a little bit about the diversity of the contributors to the volume. Terry Moylan is in there. Terry is a great historian of songs. He actually edited a collection of songs collected by Frank Hart here in Dublin. Lisa Godson is in there, brilliant on kind of material culture and fashion. Brian Crowley, museum curator, he's in there on that Portobello barracks banner. The net was cast really, really wide for this in terms of getting beyond just what we might call military historians. So many of these people would have been in the Atlas of the Irish Revolution before, but a lot of them are here for the first time too.
Yeah, the archaeologists, people like Laura McAtackney, who has that piece on Kilmainham graffiti, coming among graffiti, you know, which is fascinating story.
Marion Dowd on the cave archaeology,
caves,
Joe Bruck on the other graffiti at
absolutely,
yeah.
Folklore. Alva MacDade on poetry, which is a challenging chapter, I think, but we kind of said, is this too kind of academic, you know, for our part, but because of the use of illustrations, and you're able to sort of break it up, if you know what I mean. So it's probably the most densely academic of but you know, brilliant.
Still accessible. And
still accessible, but especially through the use of imagery and so on, I think. So yeah, I mean, the amazing thing is everyone is delighted to, I mean, that's the thing, the artists, the folklorists, the archaeologists, everybody, the goodwill is astonishing. So you're pushing at an open door, that's the beautiful thing about it, you know. It's such a community of people, it's fabulous, you know. Definitely. And they didn't get a penny, like, by the way. You know?
Before we open it up to the floor, I just want to briefly talk about the Fatalities Index, Andy Billenberg, and John Dorney, who runs that brilliant website, theirishstory.com. What it reveals is sometimes very surprising in places, and the old chestnut is now well and truly smashed in, isn't it? That more people died in the Civil War than the Easter Rising and the War of Independence combined. We were told that for years. That seems to be put to bed. But there are surprising things, aren't there, in the Fatalities Index in terms of where deaths occur and the nature of those deaths as well.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. It's such a valuable project and such incredible research by Andy and John. As John mentioned at the outset, these two projects are very much married. Both were funded by the Department of, I'm going to get this wrong because I always do. Media, etc.
The Department of Everything.
Exactly. The idea, I suppose the idea being that the fatalities would be represented in the Atlas, which indeed they are. So there's a chapter at the centre of the Atlas about the findings of the project, and as you said, many of the sort of preconceptions are very much challenged by those. They challenge, for example, the idea that as we always would have presumed, that more anti-treaty IRA or anti-treaty forces died than National Army, whereas in fact it was about 200 more. So the figure for 26 counties is 1,425. 648 of those National Army soldiers are pro-treaty. And on the other side then about 438 anti-treaty forces, and 300, the most, I think, significant contribution that this study gives us is the information about the civilian deaths, which for so long was neglected or not definitively known. So about 335 civilians, and sadly 27 of whom were children under the age of 15. And a lot of the civilian deaths happened, of course, in the urban areas, and the majority of them would have been caught in crossfire. We have an incredible photograph at the start of the Atlas, actually, of just this crowd of people on the edge of O'Connell Street looking down, and you can see how close that they're actually getting to the action, purely just to see what was happening. You can kind of understand how shrapnel might have caught them, or a bullet, unfortunately, would have caught them. So those deaths are really significant. They also have really important information on the social profiles of the combatants, which is new and very, very interesting. And also the timing of the fatalities. So we would presumed, and in fact it's confirmed, that most of the fatalities happened on the very start of the war, the high point actually being in July 1922. It came down again until May 1923, when it spiked again, and that would have been, of course, the month where you saw that those, or Terror Month as was known in Kerry, with the Ballyseedy events, and obviously executions were still very much in play at that stage. So the timing and chronologies that Andy and John's project give us really add to our understanding of it. What else does this, our age profiles again, that's new information. And then, of course, locations, as John showed you on the map, the sort of high points or the focal points, if you like, of civil war fatalities. So there's a huge amount of new information. It's not simply, you know, the person, the name, the place. It's also their ages, their social profiles, whether or not they had previous military service. And that, again, of course, explodes that myth about a preponderance of ex-British Army soldiers serving within the National Army. So there's a huge amount of new information.
Yeah, a couple of the takeaways was, what they found was there weren't that many, probably 20, 25%. 17% of National Army dead had served in the British Army, which if you extrapolate means that not that many guys in the National Army served in the British Army. And then what was the percentage for guys who had served in the IRA during the War of Independence? It was it was a little bit lower, right?
Lower, yeah.
So another kind of myth is that the National Army were pro-treaty IRA guys, when in fact actually not that many of them were. The majority of National Army soldiers were people who hadn't served in any war before, who came in. And so again, it's that kind of nuance and that kind of different ways of looking at
And
they were working class lads.
Surprising number of young working class lads who were killed by accident and killed by friendly fire.
Which is also about the lack of discipline. And yeah, absolutely.
There's a Roman mic in the crowd somewhere, so it'd be nice to take a question or two from the floor. If anyone would like to ask a question. I see a hand over here, and I see a hand here.